NCLB, the core of it, and I'm not talking about the highly qualified teacher segment or the reading first section, but the core of it, the Title I program, is structured around a set of key points that are strongly linked to each other. One is that all the students are going to be proficient by the year 2014. Then that led to the construction of this adequate yearly progress reporting, as it were, as to progress being made toward that goal of everyone proficient in 2014. That the measuring tool in every state but Nebraska is a state standardized test. And there's a set of sanctions, consequences that follow for not making AYP. And those sanctions are stiff enough to produce action. So there's a theory of action here, which says you set a goal and you tell people they're in trouble if they don't meet the goal, and supposedly they're then going to be able to go meet the goal. Now, from FairTest perspective, and many of the folks, other organizations we work with, every one of these points is deeply flawed, and when you link them all together, you have sort of a perfect storm of educational disaster. The idea that everybody's going to score proficient on an exam by the year 2014 is believed by essentially nobody. I can't imagine it's even believed by the people who passed it. All the research has been done indicates that as a result of that, schools will not be making adequate yearly progress, districts will not make adequate yearly progress, and the estimates range from 60 to 99% or even 100% of schools, and higher percentages, as it were, that is 80 to 100% of districts, will not make adequate yearly progress at some point between now and 2014. School districts with more affluent populations and fewer recent immigrants and so on, of course, will be closer to 2014 instead of now, when virtually every city has already repeatedly not made adequate yearly progress. Most of the counties in Florida that they have county school systems, they're all not making adequate yearly progress. Where I come from, Boston, not making adequate yearly progress. I'm sure Milwaukee's not, on, so that it's a guarantee you don't make it. And that's on the state test, most of which are easier to get kids to proficient on than the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is supposed to be the measuring stick. Standardized testing is, as I said, in every state except Nebraska, and I'll mention more on that later, is basically the single tool. They give a little bit of weight to the graduation requirements, but those usually set the graduation rate requirements. Those are usually set so low that they don't actually affect anything. And so what really counts is the standardized tests that every state has. And then there are the sanctions, which escalate from spending money to transport kids to spending money on tutoring. Between those are supposed to eat up to 20% of the Title I budget, which is typically what a lot of districts have been getting as their increase, which means they've been flat funded, which means basically with inflation they've been getting less money in many cases. And then on to, you have to do school planning, which is just how to get your test scores up, and you should do professional development. And it even says spend some money on professional development, and it has a list of things you could do. It's about as long as my arm, which means anything under the sun, good or bad, can count. And then you get the heavy hitting stuff of firing people, removing teachers in the subject areas that are responsible for teaching reading and math. So that means all the elementary, and in high school, of course, don't teach reading and math. In ensuing years, it's restructuring the whole school. Get rid of the principal, bring in a private contractor to run the school, make it a charter school, have the state run it. None of those things, when that law was passed, and basically to date, have any evidence that they will work. Of course, there are good charter schools. Edison sometimes has some success in some schools. State-run never has had any educational success, basically. And yes, sometimes removing really malfunctioning staff and bringing in better people does lead to some improvement, but oftentimes, as in the case of Chicago, the only places that really worked is when they also changed the student body. It's amazing what you can do if you remove low scorers and bring in high scorers to a school for the score of that school. It really works extremely well, as long as you don't pay too much attention to the other school to which the low scorers were moved. The other category is do something else. And in many places, that's exactly what they're doing. And so they're trying to provide assistance to districts Michigan's done a lot of that, Virginia does, and so you have places trying to help districts, but most of that effort and help is just based on raising test scores. So in a way, the real linchpin of this whole thing is in fact the test scores, because if you had high quality assessments, then you're dealing with this punishment makes sense, and my answer would be no. But regardless, at the moment, the critical piece is the test scores. And I'm just going to touch on this real briefly and tell you that those standardized tests don't measure but a small fraction of what kids really ought to know and be able to do. That typically when high stakes are attached to them, teachers are reporting, according to surveys all across the country, that the higher the stakes, the more they spend time teaching to the test. So, and principals encourage it, superintendents encourage it, school boards encourage it, the state encourages it. So it all flows down and lands on the head of the teachers. And what goes on essentially is that subjects like science, which is only going to be tested once every 3 years and doesn't have to be even yet in most states, history, forget it, arts, goodbye, phys ed, forget it, recess, oh, we'll eliminate that too in many places. And you end up with schooling consisting essentially of teaching reading and math, and not a whole lot else. And then within those subjects, how they are taught and what parts of them are taught mimic the tests. So that, for example, with the dibbles in reading first, that's become real popular. It's ostensibly no high stakes, but somebody's out there selling drill sheets of nonsense words, because reading nonsense words fast is part of what's on the dibbles test. So they have kids practicing reading nonsense words as part of supposedly learning to read. I'm sorry, this strikes me as pure insanity. It may or may not have been what the dibbles inventors actually intended, I don't know, but it's a sadly logical consequence of when stake starts to get attached to an extremely narrow and limited instrument. The dibbles, by the way, says it measures comprehension, and it does so by rating how fast the student reads. That's it. It's a very good tool of speed of reading. It is a low correlation, according to some studies I heard about this morning from my fellow panelists, basically low correlation with things like comprehension and understanding, which it doesn't really measure at all. So, but more broadly speaking, what you end up with is narrowing the curriculum often to fit what's on the test. One of the worst examples I ever heard of was coming out of Texas. People were talking about this, where as instruction, not even as test prep, but as a core part of the instruction, students were essentially given short passages, a couple of paragraphs with answers, with questions at the end, multiple choice. And they were taught to read by looking at the multiple choice questions and then going back to the passage. That's what they teach you on an SAT or ACT test coaching course. But this is not how you teach little kids to read. And independent people went in and started asking the kids questions about what they just read, and the kids couldn't answer it. And given a longer passage, which some people tried to do, the kids would often stop reading after 1 or 2 paragraphs because they didn't understand that reading went on longer than that. Okay? So this isn't happening, by the way, in more well-to-do districts. I can be fairly sure the worst end is not. The impact of teaching to the test is affecting even then. But in low-income districts, you get hit even heavier. And so in Milwaukee, for example, and it's sweeping the country, you have something called benchmark tests or interim tests. And essentially what those are is multiple choice tests on a computer. You get back your score right away, but it's all multiple choice, and it's organized off questions that are supposed to tell the teacher or the principal how well that kid is likely to do on the state test, so that you can intervene. Well, intervening where kids need help is of course a good idea, but again, this is all narrowly related to just what's on the test. And if you look at these tests, there's no way, frankly, I believe, that any rational person would conclude that you could actually believe from the results of a reading test that these are kids who have skills in reading, who have the knowledge to become good, serious, independent readers, are already good, serious, independent readers. And there's not a likelihood that that's what's going to get produced when all of that emphasis is on the test. Now, one could talk about making better tests, but for example, kids in high school ought to learn how to do research projects if they're going to succeed in college. What are you going to have? Multiple choice questions about research projects so that the teachers do that instead of having the kids do research projects? That's one of the consequences of this process. Kids might read stories or novels, and you might ask them, how do the different authors develop character? What are some of the themes and issues, and compare and contrast? Well, they're not going to do that on a test because you can't assume anybody's ever read the same books unless you've got the same curriculum across an entire state, which no state in this country has, and I certainly don't advocate. So there is no way that you can have depth of knowledge through these kinds of tests, unless you have a very tight curriculum and organize it around the tests. And frankly, even then, I'm very skeptical how far that'll go. But you can go further than most now do. I mean, AP tests are better than the current ones, but AP tests are like $85 a piece. So what if you had tests of that quality, 3 subjects a year, every year, right? Grades 3 through 8. You're going to spend $250 a year a kid on standardized testing because they're better tests? I'd say put it into professional development money and you'll end up with a whole lot better, because you'll have much better teachers who have time and energy then using that resource to do a much better job, and they'll do a much better assessment job in the end because they'll dig a whole lot deeper into it. So this whole process then, with the high stakes and the consequences, produces an educational disaster called teaching to the test, narrowing the curriculum, flawed decisions. I mean, lots of irrational decisions are made about, holding schools accountable because they've got a group of kids who basically don't speak English. They've just arrived here. They've been in this country 1, 2, or 3 years. They're nowhere near ready to do academic work in English only and score proficient on any standardized test. So of course the school is then punished. So there's a lot of irrationality in the process. Okay, so this law is now up for reauthorization. If it continues another 6 years, and we're in 2013 or so, I really dread to think about what schools will look like with 6 more years of hammering to teach to the tests all across this country. Again, particularly in the kids who supposedly the law is intended to help. Those kids will get left ever further behind because what they get is not a high quality education. It's a schooling designed to boost test scores. The law is, at the moment, its primary figures behind it include Senator Ted Kennedy, noted liberal from my home state, George Miller, noted liberal from California in the House. They both favor it. George Bush, of course, favors it. So there's some real heavy hitters. The business organizations largely favor it. They mostly want to see it simply reauthorized. Oh, they might add, put some teeth in the science one, add history, so then we can include history. Guarantee that then becomes an endless litany of dates and names with no understanding whatsoever, because I've never seen a state history test begin to tap thoughtfulness, and people have told me the AP one doesn't either, for that matter. But there's a real set of dangers we're facing in the reauthorization of this law. So it's critically important in our view that political will be mustered, and force and energy, so that this law is not simply reauthorized and they're forced to rethink what they're doing.